Welcome to Scaling Impact, where we decode how entrepreneurs are harnessing the power of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to create remarkable and impactful businesses that drive transformation on a global and local human scale. We explore how sustainability is elevating our human consciousness and catalyzing us to create within constraints. We decipher why now is the biggest entrepreneurial opportunity since the dawn of industrialization and what leaders and entrepreneurs can do to harness the winds of change. I'm Anders Sorman-Nielsen, global futurist, EO Sydney Impact Champion and father, and your co-host with Lisa Andrews for Scaling Impact. Welcome to EO Sydney's global podcast, Scaling Impact, where we sit down with leaders and EO members around the world who are doing amazing things, channeling their creativity, their innovation into specific UN Sustainable Development Goals. And on today's show, I've got the great privilege to introduce Christina Gerakiteys. Great to have you on Scaling Impact today, Christina.
Thank you so much, Anders. It's an absolute honour and a pleasure to be here.
Now, I'm going to just give a few words on pedigree here. We're going to firmly talk and sort of position today's dialogue within the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 10 around reduced inequalities, which is a deep passion topic of yours. I do just want to frame up the conversation here because our paths have sort of crossed both as, Sydney members, but also in the world of Singularity University, etc., exponential technologies, all the rest. So let me just give a few words here on pedigree before we launch into the conversation, Christina. So Christina Gerakiteys, and I've just learnt the fantastic Greek pronunciation, is the founder of UtopiaX, which is a business with a focus on creativity and innovation. She's also the SingularityU international expert and SingularityU Australia primary global ambassador. And this is really cool in my world as a futurist. She's a sought-after speaker, a facilitator, a program designer, creating interactive educational experiences driven by design thinking, purpose, engagement, and very, very importantly, play. She has created highly customized programs for clients including Deloitte, IAG, Bupa, Employment Hero, and of course, the Entrepreneurs Organization. So Christina, a second welcome to the show here.
Thank you so much. It's interesting hearing that come back at you, let me tell you sometimes.
So, reduced inequalities. I just think we're sitting here virtually in 2022 in September, Sydney, Australia, broadcasting, of course, globally. And we look at things like migration, refugees, the Ukraine crisis. We've got the renewed oil and energy crisis in the world. We're hearing about inflation and the cost of energy around Europe, for example, skyrocketing. There's Goldman Sachs saying that most Europeans will pay 200% on top of their energy bills this winter compared to what they did in 2021. Inequalities sort of stamped all over some of these things that are happening globally. So I'm curious, what's going on in the world, Christina? How do the UN Sustainable Development Goals play into it? And what's your passion around this idea of reducing inequality?
So I think I'm very passionate about SDG number 10, reduced inequalities, because it covers so many, Anders. So if we think about it, reduced inequalities happen in SDG number 4, for example, education. They happen in number 6, clean water and sanitation. Number 1, poverty. They happen across, gender inequality. They happen across all the SDGs. And confession, I've been a bit of a generalist my whole life. I absolutely soak up knowledge from everywhere. And I think that's why my passion in particular for SDG number 10, because it's not just a narrow field. And I've come across some absolutely remarkable, amazing individuals and organizations that are making huge dents in the universe, not just a dent in the universe, but huge dents in the universe. So I think my passion grows out of people that I've connected with, and so right now there's an organisation called Maboba's Promise. They work with refugees from Afghanistan. They're just in the process of bringing an enormous number of people into the country, women, children, and men this time into the country from Afghanistan. Absolutely conditions that from our privileged backgrounds and our privileged lifestyles, we have no idea what they're suffering. Maboba has fed hundreds of thousands of people. She made a promise as an individual woman to make a difference to her country when she came to Australia, and she has not stopped doing that. She's opened girls' schools, for example. So, there again, we've got refugees coming in, we've got poverty, we've got education, all wrapped up in this one woman's effort to help the people of her home nation. She started a school for girls, and the high school component got closed down by the Taliban last August. They're in the process of trying to open it. She is relentlessly working to make life better for so many people and reducing inequalities in that regard. So many stories like that absolutely inspire me. So if I can become involved in and contribute in some small way to what they're doing, then that gives me a much greater sense of purpose. And if I can alert people, so I love to think that part of my remit here on this planet is to enable the enablers. And the more enablers that find out information, that understand what other people are going through, then the better the difference that we can make in the world. Fantastic.
And so in terms of how this fits into your world of entrepreneurship, I'm curious, are these projects that you get involved in from a sort of social enterprise perspective, from a philanthropic perspective? Like how does this fit within the UtopiaX universe or any other businesses that you are involved in at the moment?
So I'm very fortunate in some of the keynotes, for example, that I do. I might go and do a keynote in moonshot thinking, and somebody from the audience will come and have a conversation about the dents they're making in the universe. And when I say dents, they can be huge dents. They're not necessarily little smidges. So I'm very fortunate in that way. And then in that way, I'm also able to enable the enablers. So when we talk about moonshot thinking, we might talk about something as simple as pulling water out of thin air. And I've got a beautiful example of an organisation that is based in India that actually does that. They've made a machine that pulls water out of thin air. There's organisations that, through my association with SingularityU, X Prize, for example, they've done remarkable things in education. So SDG number 4, they did an X Prize in education. You had to be able to create an app that allowed people or children in third world countries to reach basic numeracy and basic literacy in 18 months, just using your app, no adult intervention. There were some devices donated. So Bill Gates donated, I think it was 5,000 devices. They only gave 2,500 out because they knew that they would kind of need replacing. One adult was involved in the project, and that one adult was in charge of solar charging the devices at the end of each day. There was a $10 million X Prize, and if you ticked the goals, ticked the outcomes at the end, and these children had basic numeracy and literacy skills at the end, then you received part of that money. So I think things like that I bring into my work all the time. And if people know what's going on, then they're not so daunted about being able to make, they're not daunted by wanting to contribute or to finding a cause or whatever it is that they're passionate about. And so one of the actions that we ask people to take, particularly when we talk about SDGs, particularly when we talk about impact and the impact that we can have, is to find a cause. Go and have a look at all the SDGs. There's 17 of them. Each of the 17 have sub-targets. Go and have a look and knock off a tiny little bit of the sub-target. I like to say that the ocean is made up of a lot of tiny droplets of water, but when those tiny droplets of water come together and form an ocean or a lake or a huge wave, the power and the force behind that is absolutely incredible. So if we band together and join forces like that, then we can have an impact, and we can greatly contribute to reducing the inequalities that are everywhere, whether it's around age, whether it's around sex, whether it's around ethnicity, whatever the topic is where there's some aspect of reduced inequality, we can make a difference. I saw Grace Tame the other day at a breakfast, and her final words were, make a noise. So if we all made this little noise or took these little actions, the world would become an even better place. So yes, I agree with all the things you said at the beginning. There's so many things happening in the world right now, so many causes, everybody, that you can actually become involved with. We became involved. Also, we've got SU colleagues in the Ukraine, and they put the call out. So very quickly there was a group got together and started selling the artworks from the children that, they would have some of their drawings, 5, 6, 4-year-olds doing drawings. One of the groups created NFTs around those. We auctioned them off. We sold them in that way. Then there was a call out because so many of the children were losing limbs, in the bombs, and the soldiers were losing limbs. And there was a call out, what can we do as far as prosthetics and things like that went? So, the call went out to SU. Peter's involved with an organisation in the UK who do prosthetics. And they're there.
I'm going to take just a step backwards here because there's so much gold here, right? So I'm going to decode a few things and then ask for your deciphering of some of these terms, etc. I think, there's a bunch of EO listeners here, lots of entrepreneurs globally that we are broadcasting to today. They're familiar, maybe on the surface at least, with Singularity University. So I'm going to ask you in just a moment to define Singularity University, just give a little bit of context of that. Then if we can talk a little bit about what moonshots are, because that's sort of real singularity terminology. A quick reference for our international viewers as well and listeners to Grace Tame. And then fourthly, I'm going to ask you about NFTs and how they're playing a role in reducing inequality. So I've captured a few little bits there. Firstly, Singularity University before we go to moonshots.
So Singularity University is all about using exponential technologies to target humanity's grand challenges. We used to have 12 global grand challenges. We are now more closely aligned with the SDGs. And I did an interesting exercise probably 12 to 18 months ago where I mapped the global grand challenges around the SDGs, and they all fit in at some place beautifully. So whether we talk in terms of grand challenges or whether we talk in terms of SDGs, what the outcome is to make the world a better place. So number one. Number two, what's a moonshot? Is that okay for number one?
Yeah, all good. And so Singularity University, still located or centered around NASA, is it? And initiative by Peter Diamandis. You referred to Peter and Ray Kurzweil originally?
Correct. Yeah. So we're kind of working from home these days, as is most of the world after COVID.
So NASA is no longer needed.
No, but what a great place it was to go and have meetings at and run executive programs. And NASA has actually been taken over by another organisation now who are using it as their headquarters. So that's SingularityU, using technology to scale exponentially. So very much involved in high-end technology. Moonshots. So prior to becoming involved with SU, I used to run what's called Pie in the Sky or Big Open Cloud workshops. When I joined SU, I adopted their terminology, which was moonshots. And a moonshot is just that. It's taken from JFK and the famous speech he made where he said, we're going to put a man on the moon. And everybody went, we're going to what? What are we going to do? So that's where the terminology came from. And then Google adopted the moonshot and the moonshot terminology as well. They've actually changed it a little bit now. I think they're Google X now, or they're just X actually. So a moonshot is striving to make something possible that you never actually thought was possible, but trying to figure out how you're going to get there. So if you think about JFK going, we're going to put a man on the moon, yes, there had been space travel, but they hadn't put a man on the moon yet. So how they were going to deal with the oxygen factors, with the breathing, with apparatus, with gravitational pull, so many physics and algorithms and everything wrapped up into that. So how they actually got there and how they did all the calculations and the success of that whole project. And now this year we've put 2 spaceships on Mars. Last year, we put 2 spaceships on Mars. So a moonshot is knowing that you want to do something, but you have absolutely no idea how you're going to get there. So flying pig, pie in the sky, whatever you want to call it, it's that big dream and then the incremental steps that you may need to take in order to get there. So that's number 2. Do you want to remind me what number 3 was?
Grace Tame.
Okay. So Grace Tame is a voice for sexual abuse, sexual harassment in the workplace. And she has been absolutely vilified by some people for the work that she's doing. She's 27, I think. And she
Australian of the Year.
Australian of the Year last year. Yep, 2021. And she was the one that was responsible for naming the perpetrator. So she actually has brought to light the fact that why shouldn't the perpetrators be named? And that's one of the things. But she is working relentlessly now to have a voice, to give other people a voice, and to ask people to do exactly that, make a noise. So if you go and have a look at the remarkable work that she's doing, she actually has a lot of haters, which I find, and this is her, this is coming from her the other day, which is totally bizarre. But she is doing remarkable things and freeing up a lot of not just women, but men as well. So she's given everybody a voice in that sexual abuse, sexual harassment arena. And she very much made a point that it's not just happening to women. She said it was happening to 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 boys, which means that 1 in 5 people in Australia have suffered some kind of sexual abuse. So those figures are quite horrifying. So she's bringing attention to all of that.
And a real voice for reducing inequality in that very, very important space. And I can imagine that she's ruffling 1 or 2 feathers around the world, making a few people feel very uncomfortable if they have a very dark history of being perpetrators potentially, because she's literally been, changing the laws, particularly in Tasmania, but also with cascading effects in Australia. So there's probably a few people that don't like this idea that there are, strong voices, female or otherwise, who are driving real change and potentially exposing perpetrators. So I think there's a lot of unease potentially about this idea of reducing inequalities, because some people actually like the status quo.
I don't know that I can even go there, Anders. Some people do like the status quo. One of my favourite sayings is, bad things happen when good people walk past and do nothing. So if you actually see some kind of bullying and you walk past it, then does that make you any better than the bully themselves? If you see an injustice, and then we need to be very careful here, because calling out what some of these things are requires a judgment. And who's to say whose judgment is right or wrong? But clearly there's things that are clearly wrong, in my opinion. I'm just going to qualify that, because we're all the product of our perceptions, our assumptions, our geography, our socioeconomic backgrounds, etc. So our perceptions are what we then decide and define by terminating what's good and what's bad. So if we're going to, and again, the same thing, how do we define an inequality? So I think those people that have experienced inequalities in particular can very much call them out. So I remember, if I go back, so how did all this start for me? I have a Greek background, but I'm second generation. My dad was actually born in Australia. And as a Greek female that went to school, I got very much picked on and bullied. And I had some racist teachers, and I had no idea. I had a very beautiful, warm, loving, amazing family, but I would find myself being thrown up against the school shed because I had a Greek name, Gerakiteys, Greek name. So so for me, that I have this absolute disdain for bullies. Disdain may not be the right word, because I actually feel sorry for them in many regards as well. I think we need to understand the psychology of what makes people do things that they do, and usually a perpetrator has been abused, usually a bully has been bullied, but we're here to call that out and break the cycle. So many levels of inequality.
Yeah, sadly, we're all victims of victims, right? So that cycle needs to be broken. Yeah.
So, and you see these kind of things surfacing around you, and, all it takes for bad things to happen is for good people to do nothing. So there's another challenge.
And I think this was maybe the 4th thing we were going to revisit, seeing with our augmented memory here, whether we got to, was it X price was the 4th thing, if I recall, about 7 minutes ago, when we talked about the 4 things to decode and decipher. Just to give a little bit more context, tell me if I'm wrong, if my memory is unaugmented.
I actually don't think it was X Prize, but I remember thinking you were going to say X Prize. So X
there you
Prize,
go. Well, let's go back to what I actually said.
I can't remember what you said, so I'm happy to go with X Prize. But I think that we'll just put that down to the excitement of the conversation and just way too many things to talk about, which is sad in a way that there's so many reduced equalities, reducing inequalities. There's so much to talk about. But X Prize is something that was started by Peter Diamandis, Tony Robbins, and a few other friends. And they decided to put a whole lot of money into solving the world's greatest challenges and solving the SDGs. Elon Musk recently put $100 million USD behind coming up with some solutions for carbon. And the thing with the X Prize is that people often spend, I don't know that they'll spend more than $100 million, but they often spend more money trying to achieve the goal that has been set than what the prize is. I know that was the case in the 10 million education prize, which actually got distributed amongst a couple of different organisations. They're running things around ocean conservation. They're running, at one point, one of the X prizes, they were mapping the bottom of the ocean. And I kind of went, oh, what's that gonna do? But what it actually does for the ocean and ocean conservation is quite remarkable. So X Prize is all about, it's very much aligned to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the global grand challenges, but everything has to have social impact. So very much social impact driven. If you haven't yet, check them out. Also Extreme Tech Challenge. So very tech challenges in how we're going to solve the world's problems.
And what are you seeing as some heartening examples of where real changes are happening? You mentioned the NFTs, for example, or non-fungible tokens, which in fact I do think was the fourth thing we're about to talk about. So non-fungible tokens out of Ukraine, for example. Talk us a little bit about that, and then also what other examples are you seeing that are leading to real leveling, or at least the beginning of some kind of leveling, given some of the grand challenges we have around inequality in the world?
Firstly, know that NFTs have made a difference in the Ukraine, but let me bring it back a little bit closer to non-fungible tokens were very much around supporting artists and the creative industries as well. So if you think about it, somebody creates some piece of art. They wrote a song, they wrote a poem, they wrote a play, they may perform a performance. And once that leaves them, once they've given that copyright, once it belongs to somebody else, they don't get the reward that potentially something else may get. So an artist might create a piece of work, someone will create a digital copy of it, and somebody will buy that as an NFT and they will have ownership around that. And people go, yeah, but I can just take a photo of it and it becomes mine. And that's true. You can just take a photo of it and it could become yours. But there's something very intrinsic about owning the original, owning what it was in the first place. And the beauty of that is, so if I buy an NFT off an Indigenous artist, which I have, and I then sell that to somebody else, part of that profit will go back to the Indigenous artist. So every time something gets sold, a small portion of that money will go back to the original artist, which I think is a really amazing way to create that sustainability for the creative industries as well. So NFTs, they're not my area of expertise, but I do know that they have served community well and they have done a lot to help reduce those inequalities globally and locally. So that's an NFT answer. I think another inspiring story outside of Maboba's promise for me is the work that Aminata is doing in Sierra Leone. So Sierra Leone, Africa, has a mortality rate, mothers giving birth, childbirth mortality rate of 1 in 17. 1 in 17. They have one midwife for something like 25 million people. And that, for us, where we are, again, coming from, Australia, coming from privilege, we really are privileged. And everybody's not privileged in Australia. I feel I'm extremely privileged in Australia. coming from there, I think it's quite remarkable that people are now aware of this. And this is where I think technology actually comes to its fore. So many years ago, this was still happening. Actually, they've made improvements in the maternal death rate in Sierra Leone over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we never would have known that this was an issue. We never would have known that clean water and sanitation was such an issue in so many different countries. I mean, let's face it, now it's actually an issue in one of the American places because they're getting black water basically out of their taps. So it's now not just third world countries, it's happening in countries like the US as well. Clean water and sanitation, such a difference that can make. And clean water, if you drink clean water, if you're eating food that's been washed in clean water, you are less likely to get sick. If you're less likely to get sick, it means you can go to work. If you're less likely to get sick as a child, you can go to school. So, the whole education process is propelled because you don't need any sick days because you're having clean water. So things where technology comes in and the awareness of these issues comes in, through technology as well, the awareness, but also the creation of things like pulling water out of thin air. And being able to have machines set up in humid areas that will extract the water so that people have drinking water. There's some very basic innovations that have been made around allowing light into shanties. There's a guy who goes around cutting holes in the tin roofs of shanties, putting kerosene in the bottom of a soda bottle, putting it in, and the light that's refracted is the word I'm actually looking for, is then allowing 1 or 2 hours extra of daylight so the kids can do their homework. Just small changes that have made such a big difference at reducing inequalities.
Yeah, because I mean, it's needed more so now than ever before. I mean, a few years ago, you had the likes of, Steven Pinker, Peter Diamandis that you mentioned, Hans Rosling and a plethora of other thinkers sort of talking about, factfulness and the fact that, we are living in the golden age of at least approaching some level of equality compared to, several decades ago or several centuries ago. In fact, the world is moving towards being more equitable. But then the pandemic happened, and certainly there was a bit of a course correction. So the statistics from the United Nations is that, the pandemic has actually, for the first time, led to a rise in between country income inequality in a generation. 5,895 migrants lost their lives in 2021. We've got 1 in 5 people have experienced discrimination, or at least one of the grounds prohibited under an international human rights law, for example. I mean, what do you make out of this? What's been the impact of the pandemic? How do we get back on the right and the equitable course?
So I think there's been positives and negatives that have come out of the pandemic. I think you've just highlighted very tragic ones. So particularly the loss of migrant lives. People haven't been able to move between borders, but then on the other hand, some people have moved easily between borders. And I know there were some immigrants that landed from Albania in Greece, for example, and the Greeks took them in, fed them, watered them, clothed them, etc. So there's all these alternate stories that we may not see in the figures that have been collected. So good and not so good things. Again, there's a judgment in that, but clearly nearly 6,000 migrants losing their lives is absolutely tragic. I also think that we're very good at highlighting the negatives. Peter has a whole list. Peter Diamandis has a whole list of things that have improved over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and how less people are dying from disease, etc. You're right, absolutely correct. The pandemic threw some of that backwards, but the pandemic also made us aware of mental health issues. We were never so aware, or maybe we were aware, but they were kind of swept under the carpet. And now
stigmatized, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So now it's not so stigmatized. Now we are banding together to help people. I have never been asked, "Are you okay?" so many times as I was a few days ago on September 9 when it was "Are you okay?" Day in Australia. So I think things like that have been highlighted. The joy that people found in playing music from balconies, what was highlighted. So that camaraderie that it didn't matter where you were, really. There was this sense of community that was happening. So in areas, the pandemic actually did take us back to this sense of community and listening to each other, talking to each other, interacting with each other. And again, if we didn't have the technology, however, we never would have known what was going on. The technology also allowed for open sourcing around, we need to fix this. What can we do? So a lot of the pharmaceuticals and so there's a whole other debate around vaccines and everything else. And that's not the purpose of this conversation. But the purpose of this conversation is to say it opened up for collaboration. And collaboration is one of the biggest things that's needed to reduce inequalities globally. And it's not only just globally that we need to reduce the inequalities, it's in our own homes, it's in our own communities, it's in our schools and our workplaces. And they don't have to be huge things that we're noticing. They might be something much smaller. So, SDG number 10, reduced inequalities, has 7, 8 subcategories. And some of those subcategories themselves, if we make a small dent in those. And I think what the pandemic has done is given an individual a voice, and it's actually celebrated a lot of people for their uniqueness, and said that we can all make a difference, but we don't all have to make a difference like Peter Diamandis or, Rosa Parks, although Rosa Parks is another story in itself. We can all make our small steps to make the world a better place. And there's a beautiful New Zealand Maori saying, I wish I had actually had it up on a screen so I could have read it, but it's Waka Papa, I think is how it's pronounced, and it talks about the legacy that we want to leave behind. And I think if we can focus on the legacy that we want to leave to our children, our children's children, our children's children's children, a lot of the ancient tribes looked forward 7 generations, not just to the grandchildren or the great grandchildren that you and I might one day have or might one day think that far ahead, but it's ahead 7 generations. What kind of planet do we want to leave them? What kind of sustainability do we want to leave them? What kind of medical situation do we want to leave them? So always thinking in terms of community, and I think the pandemic helped highlight potentially some of the inequalities around community and has hopefully brought us. I'm an idealist. I'm an optimist. Always will be. Always have been. It doesn't mean I like to think that I have my head in the clouds, but my feet planted firmly on the ground. And that's why one of my favourite sayings is ideation without execution is hallucination. So we can talk about these things, but if we're not actually actively involved in changing one small thing or 2 small things or 3 big things, depending on the energy that you want to put behind it, then for me, it's hallucination.
So you have this, you sort of inhabit this space that I think is really fascinating in terms of, the intersection between SingularityU, the entrepreneurs organization, the sense that technology can lead to exponential social impacts around the world, and then of course with a smattering of UN SDGs in there in the middle as well, and I think of one of those goals, and I think the United Nations has been quite intelligent in the way that it's actually sort of doubled down on the role of technology within this framework that is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because when it comes to reduced inequality, they even point out things like that by 2030 we should be able to reduce to less than 3% the transaction costs of migrant remittances and eliminate remittance corridors with costs higher than 5%. And again, to me, when you mention NFTs before, or when we think about the blockchain or new payment technologies, these are all technologies that can actually help democratize access to funding, to get people paid for their intellectual property, etc. Have you got any thoughts on that particular sub-goal or other technologies that you see making a real impact when it comes to reducing inequalities?
I think blockchain, I think Bitcoin and all the other, Ethereum, all the other coins, were actually reaching a point of effectiveness prior to the pandemic and then early on in the pandemic, and we were truly looking at it truly looking at them as a token for exchange. I think since the pandemic and the fear, the insecurity they potentially have, well, we know they've dropped back. We know their share prices have gone down. I think the propensity for change in how we measure things financially is super important. We don't do things just for money. And I know in the sub-targets of the SDGs, there is a lot of talk around finance and flow or financial flows, etc. I think the technology actually has the capacity to override a lot of that. So one of the most impactful conversations that was pointed my way was by a colleague, Ramez Naam from SingularityU. And we were talking about, this is some years ago now, maybe 3-4 years ago now, we were talking about the cellular grown food. So cellular grown eggs, cellular grown milk, lab grown meat, which I had the opportunity to taste. And that's a story in itself that, if I remember, I'll share with you as well, because I've been a vegetarian for a long time. But I said to Ramez, I don't know if I could feed my young children cell grown eggs, cell grown milk. And he looked at me and he said, you're not the reason they're being developed. And I went, oh. He said, if you're a mother in a third world country and you knew that this egg held the nutritional capacity that the egg that you could buy at the supermarket that's not cell grown, that comes from the chicken, or that this milk that was grown in a laboratory had the same nutritional capacity and wasn't going to hurt your kids but was going to feed them, what would you do? Like, no brainer. Okay. So I think technology has the capacity to help us reduce inequalities in so many different ways. We've already spoken about education. We've spoken about refugees. Now we've just touched on food. We've spoken about clean water. Technology can have an effect on every single one of those SDGs and help us get to those goals faster. And the other thing is I actually think the pandemic showed us how to cut through a lot of that red tape. So if I go back to your comment about, making it easier, let's just call it making it easier for refugees to cross barriers and things like that. We learnt during COVID that we can cut red tape, we can cut bureaucracy when we absolutely have to and need to. We were dealing with some organisations around medtech. And we were trying to get this whole thing around online consultations, because if you're living in outback Australia, by the time you actually get to the doctor, it may actually be too late to treat whatever it is, or you're not even going to go because it's too much effort. All of a sudden, telehealth was okay during COVID because otherwise places were shutting down. And I think we came to the realization that we don't need to go through as much bureaucracy, as much red tape. Usually something's been put through bureaucracy and there's been a red mark next to it and you've now got to do 10 steps in order to cross that barrier because one person or two people have done something wrong, even though 1,000 people may have worked the system properly and, contributed and done all of that. But we make so many rules because one person made a mistake or two people made a mistake, rather than teach those people how not to make a mistake, rather than, maybe we need to double up on the efforts of the whole fraud and cybersecurity. And that's a whole other thing as far as reducing inequalities goes. Maybe that's where we need to double down the efforts, but we know that things can get cut and we know that technology has the capacity to hasten up feeding the world poor, making sure everyone's got clean water, making, renewable energies. It just drives me insane sometimes, the conversations around, is climate change real? Is it not real? You know what? Even if it's not real, let's respect the planet. If you think it's not real, I'm not in that basket. No way actually think that climate change isn't real. Let's make changes. Let's revere the planet.
Well, I mean, the thing here is as well, I mean, like the human factor comes into it. I mean, I've sat and had conversations and some dialogues with people who love eating highly processed meat products like, frankfurters or hot dogs, for example, that come from, factory farmed animals and have been processed to the nth degree, express skepticism towards lab-grown meats. And I'm kind of going, okay, well, what is the real difference here? And sometimes it's just the legacy, the status quo, the incumbent ideas that actually threaten progress towards the future. Now, we're nearly into the final innings here. We're going to have a few sort of rapid-fire question minutes together, Christina, in just a moment. But before we go there, I'd just like to see if there's a particular call to action or some practical things that listeners to our show, both EO members and future EO members, might just want to think about as they start baking into their business models, sustainable development goals, or even how they can get involved in some of their philanthropic work as well.
So the first thing I would suggest is that you have a really good look at the Sustainable Development Goals and pick one that stands out to you. The second thing is there's a whole lot of sub-targets attached to those goals. Don't just go, oh, how on earth am I going to solve the world problem around clean water and sanitation? Dig deeper. There might be some tiny little effect that you can make, that tiny dent in the universe, that one person that you can provide clean water to, that's going to make it. It might even just be what water you buy, and that the background of where the water comes from and where the donations are going, things like that. So dig deep, find something that you're passionate about, and then get behind the cause, even if it is just to buy that product, if it is to talk about it over dinner, if it is to make a greater number of people aware of it. What I really enjoy doing, we do a lot of culture work within organisations, and we'll often attribute a value to an action. So I don't believe in just having nouns. Everything has to be verbified, if you like. So find what is happening within your organisation and express that as a verb as far as the SDGs go. So if it's, I don't like bullying, one of the reduced inequalities, let's not accept bullying at all in the workplace. Don't stand by. Have a conversation with somebody. See what it is that you can do about it. So verbify the sub-targets of the SDGs, if you like, and take action within the organisation. And the other thing that a lot of organisations, a lot of small companies, SMEs, EOers, won't even be aware that they're doing, although I think a lot of EOers are very conscious of the actions that they're taking and the SDGs and the impact, the social impact that they want to have. But even if you're not, have a think about what it is that you're doing and align that to something that is SDG, integrated. And once you start realizing the small things that you're already doing, it's actually easier to add something else to it. So have the conversations is the big thing.
Now, I know you're writing a book at the moment around success, one failure at a time. So I'd just like to ask you, what's a failure, or how has a failure or an apparent failure set you up for later success? And secondly, do you have a favorite failure of yours that's led to your success thus far?
So celebrating success one failure at a time is what we're talking about, and it is definitely that. So I actually don't believe in the word failure anymore. For me, a bit cliche now, but they are lessons that we learn along the way. And I actually tell some of the startups that I work with, you're allowed 5 minutes on the floor in the fetal position, then you got to get back up and start all over again. I think maybe one of my so I tell the story at the beginning of the book around an event I was organising and how everything kept falling over. And I also happened to be reading The Surrender Experiment by Michael Singer at the time. And I'm just throwing my hands up all the time going, I surrender, like this speaker dropped out. I surrender. The name of the actual event changed. I surrender. How is this all going to work around, right? The probably 72 hours before the event. One of my clients who was speaking at the event, we were doing some PR work together, rang me and said, I've been offered a spot on the Today Show. It's exactly when you want me to be on the session with you. I can't. What am I going to do? I said, well, clearly, if I'm your PR advisor, which I'm working with you in this capacity as right now, I'm going to say, go and be on the Today Show. So it was like, okay, what happens now? Anyway, we kind of got to the event itself, and at the exact time that she was going to present on television and come live on TV, we actually had the screen set up and we clicked to her straight away. So at the end of the day, you end up where it is that you need to be. And that's the biggest lesson I've learned from quite a lot of failures. So sometimes when the door blocks, it's the universe going, no, you're not meant to go through this one. There's one opening soon. And so I think that's been my biggest lessons out of failures, which I tend not to call failures anymore. I tend to call them life lessons. And I think they happen all the time. And parenting is one of the biggest ones. So my mother used to say all the time, she'd say, because I said so, because, I was a why child. Why can't I do this? Why? And she'd go, eventually she'd say, because I said so. And I go, well, I'm never going to say that to my children. Anyway, clearly one day my son's going, why? And I've gone, because I said so. And I've gone, oh, no. And I think so those kind of understandings give you a fresh understanding of what's come before you and what will also come in front of you. I don't even know if I've answered your question, but
yeah, I was going to say, as a parent to young ones, what should I answer next time then? So not because I said so. Is there a more clever way around that one, just for all the parents out there?
Yeah. So here's my line. I'm a first timer at this as well. I've never had a 13-year-old daughter, a 15-year-old son, a 4-year-old. I'm a first timer at this, and I am making the best decisions I can through love for you. They may not be the decisions that you want me to make, but they're the best ones I can. How's that?
It's a nice one. Yeah. Final question to you, Christina, and thank you so much for a lovely chat and for bringing your passion around this topic around reduced inequalities. And of course, you can learn much more about the UN SDGs and the entrepreneurs organizations, EO's role within the UN SDGs by Googling EO and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as well. But final bit here, you talked about yourself as an enabler of the enablers. If you had a gigantic billboard that lots and lots of people would be able to see, what would you put on it and why?
I would put on it, open your hearts and minds to all possibilities and to every person that you come across, and love unconditionally, because that's my North Star. That's my lifelong lesson that I've set for myself, is to love unconditionally. I'm failing. There you go. There's my major failure right there. I fail at that on a daily basis, but I'm trying super hard at that. So if you open your heart and mind to everyone and everything that's possible, loving unconditionally. And if we do that, then we'll have that respect. Doesn't mean that we have to agree with everyone around the world, but we will have a mutual respect and understanding, and we will hopefully be able to respect our differences, but not the inequality.
Fantastic, Christina. Thank you so much for being on the show. And of course, if you enjoyed Scaling Impact, it would be fantastic if you're happy to share it with a friend. Make sure you subscribe in Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever your favorite local podcatcher is, because that helps the algorithms enjoy the show and, of course, help us scale the impact, like conversations like the one we've just had with Christina Gerakiteys. Do I say it correctly, Christina?
You did a very good job, Anders.
It's my Swedish, Australian, Greek version. Thank you so much for being on Scaling Impact, Christina.
Thank you. And you guys are doing remarkable work. It's wonderful having the SDGs themselves highlighted like this. Thank you so much.
Cool. See you in the future.
Thank you for tuning in to Scaling Impact. Make sure you subscribe to the show in your podcatcher, and we'd be super grateful if you leave us a great review. For more information about Scaling Impact, the Entrepreneurs Organisation, or our work on sustainable innovation, please check out EO Sydney online. We would appreciate if you can take a moment to share the podcast with a friend or a colleague and help build the movement. We hope that what we learn together on Scaling Impact can help us all build a sustainable future for ourselves and our children. See you in the near future.